The sound of shattering crystal cut through the string quartet's waltz like a gunshot, and every head in the grand reception hall of the Beauclair Hotel turned toward the source. But the gasp that followed wasn't for the broken glass. It was for the blood. Trudy Vance hadn't meant to be a hero. She had meant, very specifically, to carry a tray of champagne flutes from the service corridor to table 7 without incident, which was a goal she had been failing at for the better part of 6 months. At 26 years old, Trudy was 5'3", 262 pounds on a good morning, and constitutionally incapable of moving through a crowded room without apologizing to someone. She bumped shoulders. She clipped chair backs. She once knocked an entire charcuterie tower off a sideboard during a bachelorette party and had to spend 40 minutes reconstructing it in the back kitchen, while the event coordinator hissed at her in rapid-fire French. The Beauclair was a Montreal institution. Its gilded ceilings, hand-laid marble floors, and meticulously trained staff existed to make the obscenely wealthy feel appropriately worshipped. Trudy had gotten the catering job through her cousin's boyfriend's sister, which was the kind of employment chain that usually ended badly, and had been told on her first day by the head of hospitality, a man named Renaud who wore his blazer like a moral judgment, that she was on a 90-day probationary period, and that he would be watching her. She needed the job, not in the vague, modern sense of needing things that were really just wants. She needed it in the way that her mother's rent in Verdun needed to be paid by the 15th. In the way that her younger brother Cody's type 1 diabetes supplies were $70 a month after provincial coverage. In the way that the collection agency had called 3 times in the past 2 weeks about a credit card bill Trudy's ex-boyfriend had run up in her name before he disappeared to Calgary with a woman he'd met at a Flames game. She endured Renaud's clipped disapproval. She endured the sidelong looks from the other servers, a sleek, uniformly thin crew who moved through the Beauclair's events like water and occasionally spoke to Trudy with the careful, slightly too loud enunciation people reserved for foreigners and the very elderly. She kept her head down, her apron tied as neatly as she could manage over her wide hips, and she carried her trays and topped-up glasses and pretended not to notice when guests looked through her as if she were furniture. The woman who changed everything was named Helene Vauquelin. Trudy had been assigned to the Vauquelin table. Table 1, of course, the round at the very center of the reception hall for the Beauclair's annual fundraising gala. The event was nominally in support of a children's arts foundation, but anyone paying attention knew it was really a gathering of Montreal's most powerful criminal dynasty and their legitimate world allies, all dressed in black tie and pretending to care about painting classes for disadvantaged youth. Helene Vauquelin was 68 years old, white-haired, and carried herself with the particular elegance of a woman who had survived things that would have destroyed lesser people. She was the mother of Armand Vauquelin, a name that appeared occasionally in the business pages of La Presse, and frequently in the sealed court documents that never quite made it to trial. Armand ran import and logistics across the St. Lawrence corridor, which was the polite way of saying he controlled a significant portion of what moved through Quebec, without anyone official being able to prove it. He was 41, rarely photographed, and reportedly had not smiled at anything that wasn't a balance sheet in roughly a decade. Trudy didn't know any of this on the night of the gala. She knew that Helene Vauquelin was kind, which was more than she could say for most of the guests. When Trudy had fumbled a bread plate near the beginning of the evening and caught it at the last second, Helene had looked up from her conversation and said, quietly and without drama, "Good reflexes," which was the nicest thing anyone at the Beauclair had said to Trudy in 6 months. She had also noticed, in the careful, unobtrusive way she had learned to notice things while being invisible, that Helene occasionally lost the thread of a conversation mid-sentence, that her eyes sometimes went briefly, painfully unfocused before she pulled herself back, that she had already asked Trudy twice what the soup course was, despite Trudy having answered her just minutes before. Trudy recognized it. Her grandmother had gone the same way. She didn't say anything. It wasn't her place. She refilled water glasses and kept watch from the service corridor. The woman who ruined everything arrived late. Her name was Sabine Ducharme, and she was the only daughter of Thierry Ducharme, the Vauquelin family's principal rival, and, according to rumor that circulated in the kitchen that evening, Armand Vauquelin's intended. The engagement had been arranged to end a decade of territorial friction between two organizations that had been carving up Montreal's criminal landscape since before Trudy was born. Sabine was 30, startlingly beautiful in a high-voltage, slightly terrifying way, and wearing a silver gown that had clearly been designed by someone who considered fabric a suggestion. She arrived on her father's arm and immediately scanned the room with the expression of someone calculating the value of everything in it. Trudy noticed her because it was impossible not to. She also noticed the way Helene Vauquelin's posture changed when Sabine crossed the room, a subtle involuntary stiffening, like a woman bracing herself. The gala wound through its dinner service without incident. Trudy kept her head down and her tray level, and managed to get through the entree course without catastrophe, which felt, by the Beauclair standards, like a personal triumph. It was during the cocktail hour that followed dinner, when the string quartet switched to something livelier and the wait staff was circulating with dessert trays, that Trudy realized Helene was missing from table 1. The chair was empty. The older woman's silk clutch was still looped over the chair back. Trudy set her tray down behind the service partition and went to find her. She checked the foyer first, then the powder room corridor. Then, following a half-remembered instinct she couldn't have explained, she turned down the quiet east hallway that led to the hotel's garden terrace, a narrow glass-walled space where potted olive trees and low ambient lighting created a pocket of near silence away from the noise of the gala. She heard the voices before she reached the glass doors. "You think he'll let you sit at that table once we're married?" Sabine Ducharme's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular quality of a woman who had learned early that cruelty lands harder when it's quiet. "You'll be in a facility somewhere in the Laurentians before the ink is dry on the contract. Armand already knows you're a liability. He just hasn't had the decency to say it to your face." Trudy pressed herself against the wall, looking through the gap where the door hadn't fully latched. Helene stood near the iron railing at the far end of the terrace. She was gripping it with both hands, her knuckles pale, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman fighting to hold herself together when her mind was working against her. She looked disoriented and frightened and very old, and something about the sight of it made Trudy's throat close. "Armand loves me," Helene said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her. "He would never. Armand is practical," Sabine interrupted. "And you forgetting the names of guests and wandering the hallways at 3 in the morning is not practical. We've all seen it. We all talk about it." She stepped closer. "You are an embarrassment to his legacy. He is just too polite to tell you." Helene's hand slipped from the railing. She swayed slightly, and in reaching out to steady herself, her arm brushed the small side table at her elbow. A glass of red wine tipped, and the dark contents spilled across the front of Sabine Ducharme's silver gown in a wide, terrible arc. The terrace went silent. Then Sabine screamed. Not a shocked scream, a furious one. "You senile old wreck," she hissed, her voice dropping immediately back to that precise, controlled register, which was somehow worse than shouting. Her right hand came up, a flat, vicious, open-palmed swing aimed directly at the older woman's face. On her middle finger, a massive statement ring caught the terrace light. Chunky white gold, set with a cluster of stones cut into jagged, asymmetrical points. Trudy was through the door before she made the decision to move. She would think about it later, lying in a hospital bed with the left side of her face wrapped in gauze, and she still wouldn't be able to explain the sequence of events in her own body. One moment she was in the hallway. The next she was crossing the terrace at a pace her knees had not been consulted about, and then she was between Sabine Ducharme and Helene Vauquelin, and then there was a sound, and then there was a very profound, very white pain, and then the cold stone floor of the terrace was against her cheek, and she wasn't entirely sure how she'd gotten there. She heard Helene saying her name, not her last name, her first name the way the older woman had learned it in the quiet exchange at the bread plate earlier in the evening. Trudy. Oh, Trudy, my dear. She heard Sabine saying something that she was fairly sure contained the phrase disgusting cow, and then she heard another sound, the terrace doors, both of them, opening together, and then she heard nothing at all except a silence so complete and so sudden that it was more frightening than any noise. Leave. One word, barely above a murmur. But the quality of it was something Trudy had never heard before. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat in the conventional sense, because threats implied a possibility of things going differently. This was simply a statement of what was about to happen. Trudy turned her head very slowly, because turning her head quickly was currently inadvisable, and she saw Armand Vauclain for the first time. He was not what she'd expected, which was irrational, because she hadn't had expectations. He was tall and broad-shouldered and dressed in a black suit that had never been off the rack in its life. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had become something more interesting than handsome over time. Jaw slightly too sharp, eyes very dark, the kind of lines around his mouth that come from holding a great many things very carefully in check for a very long time. He was flanked by two men who stood the way that certain men learn to stand when their job is to be the last thing a person sees. He was looking at Sabine Ducharme the way you look at a problem you have already solved. "Get her out," he said to the men without looking away from Sabine. Her father, too. Sabine opened her mouth. Then she looked at his face and closed it again. She picked up her ruined skirt and walked past him without another word, her heels clicking in rapid, retreating percussion down the hallway. Then Armand Vauclain crossed the terrace and crouched down beside his mother and the woman bleeding on his hotel floor. "Maman!" His voice changed entirely when he spoke to Helene. The coldness didn't disappear exactly, but something underneath it surfaced, something almost painful to witness. "Are you hurt?" "She's not hurt." Helene's voice was thin with urgency. This girl jumped in the way, Armand. She took it for me. Her hands were shaking as she pressed her silk evening wrap against Trudy's cheekbone. "She saved me." Armand shifted his gaze to Trudy's face. Trudy, who was still lying on the stone floor of a hotel terrace, with one side of her face producing a surprising amount of blood, and who had at least 6 immediate reasons to be humiliated, looked back at him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Trudy Vance," she said. Her voice was embarrassingly steady. She had gone to a strange, calm place on the other side of the pain. "I'm with the catering." Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "Not anymore," he said. He didn't leave. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward. He didn't hand her off to the hotel's medical staff or make a call and disappear back into his gala. He stayed while the EMTs arrived, his jacket folded on the cold stone, kneeling on the terrace floor of his own hotel with absolutely no apparent concern for his trousers. He rode with his mother to the Hôpital Général because Helene refused to go without Trudy in the car, and Trudy refused to go anywhere that was costing someone money. And the only way to resolve the impasse was for Armand to commandeer one of his own vehicles and come along. In the trauma bay at the hospital, they found something no one had anticipated. Trudy had begun seizing 20 minutes after admission. Her blood pressure was crashing. The attending physician, a brisk woman named Dr. Lebrun, who dealt in facts, came out to the private waiting room where Armand sat with his mother and said the words she'd been piecing together since the blood work came back. The laceration itself is significant but manageable. What concerns us is the presentation of neurotoxic symptoms. We're seeing peripheral vasoconstriction, cardiac irregularity, and preliminary neurological signs consistent with a synthetic compound entering the bloodstream through the wound. Dr. Lebrun looked at Armand directly. Monsieur Vance was struck by a ring. We believe the ring was the delivery mechanism. The room was quiet for a long time. Armand said, "What compound? We're running confirmation now." But the profile suggests something engineered for cardiovascular failure. Slow acting, but effective. Her weight is actually an advantage here. The sheer volume of her circulatory system is diluting the toxin's concentration, buying us time. Dr. Lebrun paused. If a smaller person had taken that strike, we would not be having this conversation. Armand sat back in his chair. He did not move for nearly a full minute. Helene was supposed to be at that railing, Helene, who was barely 115 pounds. Helene, who was the only person in 3 decades of his life that Armand Vauclain had never been able to be cold toward, because some walls simply do not extend to your mother, even when you have spent years convincing yourself otherwise. The ring had not been thrown in anger. The wine had been spilled on purpose. The slap had been the plan all along. Thierry Ducharme had not come to this gala to forge a peace. He had come to collect an inheritance. Armand took out his phone. What happened over the following 4 hours would be described later, in the few circles where it was discussed at all, as a controlled demolition. The Ducharme organization's warehousing contracts along the South Shore were severed simultaneously when 3 separate suppliers received communication that their agreements were no longer operative. The private banking relationships that had kept Thierry Ducharme's offshore accounts liquid for 9 years discovered, within a 2-hour window, that their principals had been quietly transferred and their records were being reviewed. A federal inspector who had been on Ducharme's payroll received a package at his home address in Brossard, not a threat, just a photograph, and a note that said simply, "The next one goes to your wife." Armand did not raise his voice. He did not leave the hospital. He sat in a chair in the private wing waiting room and made calls in intervals between the updates from Dr. Lebrun, and by 3 in the morning, Thierry Ducharme was no longer in possession of anything that mattered. Trudy didn't know any of this when she woke up. She woke to white ceiling tiles and the particular smell of a private hospital room, cleaner than a regular room, quieter, with flowers that had actually been changed recently. Her face ached from her cheekbone down to her jaw, and there was a tight, mechanical feeling in her left hand where the IV was taped down. She felt simultaneously very tired and very awake, the way you feel when your body has made some significant decisions without consulting you. Helene Vauclain was asleep in the chair beside her bed. Trudy lay still for a moment, watching the older woman's chest rise and fall, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her evening gown still on because apparently no one had thought to bring her other clothes, her hands folded in her lap around a rosary that had seen better decades. She wouldn't go home. Trudy turned her head toward the door. Armand Vauclain was standing in the doorway. He had taken off his jacket and tie, rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and was holding 2 coffees from somewhere that was probably not the hospital vending machine. He looked like a man who had done a very large amount of work in the last several hours and was not going to end it. "She sat with you all night," he said, his voice low so as not to wake his mother. "I tried 3 times. He crossed the room and set one of the coffees on the tray table within Trudy's reach. "How do you feel?" "Terrible," Trudy said, which was honest. "That's appropriate." He sat down in the second chair, the chair on the other side of her bed, the one that wasn't occupied by his sleeping mother. "The attending says you'll need another day for observation and then outpatient follow-up for the next 2 weeks. The laceration will scar. The toxin is cleared." Trudy absorbed this. "The ring was poisoned," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, it was meant for her." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." Trudy looked at the ceiling. "Okay," she said finally. "I probably need to call my brother." Something flickered in Armand's face, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one. "We can arrange that." "There are a few other things I would like to arrange if you're willing to listen." She turned her head to look at him, which was uncomfortable and worth it. "Your employment at the Beauclair will not be an issue," he said, "because you will not be returning to the Beauclair. I'm aware that's not what you came in expecting. If you want something else in hospitality, I have 8 properties in the province and the city, and I will find you a role that pays 3 times what Renault was giving you. If you want something different entirely, tell me what it is." He paused. "Your brother's medical costs will be covered. Whatever your mother's situation is with housing, it's resolved. The debt with the credit agency, we are aware of it, and it is no longer your problem." Trudy stared at him. "You don't know anything about me. I know you work 6 days a week, and you haven't taken a personal day in 4 months," he said. "I know you send most of your pay to 2 other people. I know you've been spoken to like you don't matter in that building every day for half a year, and you kept showing up anyway." He held her gaze. I know you threw yourself in front of a poisoned ring to protect a woman you'd known for 3 hours, with nothing to gain from it except a very bad evening." The room was very quiet. In the chair beside the bed, Helene Vauclain breathed slowly and steadily. "You have been invisible to people who should have seen you for a long time," Armand said. "That is over now." Trudy's eyes were filling. She was not, as a rule, a crier, and she resented the tears on a biological level, but there was apparently a limit to how much a person could absorb in 18 hours before something in them simply gave way. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was steady. The tears were doing what they wanted, but her voice was hers. Armand looked at his mother's sleeping face for a moment. Then he looked back at Trudy. "Because she would be dead," he said simply. "And I would have spent the rest of my life knowing she died frightened and alone on a hotel terrace while I was 20 meters away shaking hands with the man who arranged it." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees. "You didn't owe her anything, Trudy. You didn't owe me anything. You threw yourself into the middle of something you didn't understand, and you bled on my floor, and you survived. And I am constitutionally incapable of letting that go unremarked." "Most people would say thank you," Trudy said. "Most people," he agreed. The not-quite smile was back. "I am told I am not most people." Helene Vauclain stirred in her chair, blinking awake with the slow, careful emergence of someone returning from somewhere far away. She looked at Trudy first, checking, the way someone checks the thing they are most afraid to lose. Then she saw her son in the chair on the other side of the bed, and something in her expression settled into a relief so complete it was almost grief in reverse. "You're both here," she said. Her voice was soft with sleep and something warmer. "We're both here," Armand said. Trudy reached out her right hand, the one without the IV, and Helene took it immediately, both hands wrapped around Trudy's wide palm and held on. 3 weeks later, the news in certain circles was that Thierry Ducharme had been seen at the metro on Saint Laurent, buying groceries with a points card. His daughter was reportedly in Lyon, where she knew people, though the people she had known best in Montreal no longer took her calls. The Ducharme organization's former territories had redistributed themselves, the way water finds new channels after a dam breaks, with minimal drama and permanent effect. Armand Vauclain did not announce any of this. He didn't need to. Trudy had been given a suite on the second floor of the Vauclain family's Outremont property, a room that was larger than her mother's entire apartment, with a window that looked out over a garden going brown and bare in the late October cold. She had been given a wardrobe that someone with actual taste had assembled, and the very pointed information that she was welcome to use the hotel's facilities whenever she liked, and that no one was timing how long she spent in the pool. Her brother Cody had texted her 17 times in the last 24 hours, alternatively panicked and ecstatic about the fact that his next 3 years of medical supplies had been arranged without anyone asking him how to spell his last name. She was sitting in the garden in her coat when Armand found her, because she was working through the particular emotional vertigo of having your life changed without warning. And the garden, bare and cold as it was, felt more real than the room. He sat down beside her on the iron bench without preamble, which she had come to understand was simply how he did things. He pulled his coat tighter and looked at the bare rose canes trained against the stone wall. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking about whether this is real." She looked at him sideways. "Do people usually have to think about that?" "People in your situation often do." She considered this. "What exactly is my situation?" Armand was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man who has thought carefully about how to be honest about something. "You are the only person who has done something for my mother without being paid to, or afraid to, or obligated to," he said. "In my world, that is genuinely remarkable. I find that I want to know everything about how a person like that exists." He paused. "That is not a small thing for me to say. I'm told I am not a person who says things like that. Who told you that?" "My mother, mostly." Trudy laughed. It surprised both of them, a real laugh, shorter and slightly more undignified than she might have planned, that dissolved into a breath that was close to a sob before it came back around to something steadier. She's going to get worse, Trudy said quietly when the laugh had finished. Your mother. I'm not saying you don't know. I want to say it out loud, because I think you've been carrying it without saying it. The silence that followed was long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then Armand exhaled. Yes, he said. She needs people who know her, who won't panic when she gets confused, or treat her like something broken. Trudy looked at the bare roses. I can be that. I'm not saying it to earn anything. I'm saying I want to. Armand looked at her. In the pale, flat light of a late Quebec autumn, with a bandage still visible under the edge of her scarf, she looked like exactly what she was, a 26-year-old woman from Verdun who had stumbled into someone else's war and won it. Not by being exceptional in any of the ways that the Beauclair's version of the world recognized. By being, in the most fundamental and uncomplicated sense, good. I know, he said. She turned and found him closer than she'd expected, his dark eyes carrying something open and unguarded that she suspected very few people had ever seen and lived to describe. I'd like to earn that too, he said. If you're willing to give me time. Trudy Vance had walked into the Beauclair 6 months ago with a catering uniform that pulled across her shoulders and a supervisor who looked at her like an arithmetic problem he couldn't solve. And she had kept her head down and done her job and survived. Because surviving was what she knew how to do. She looked at Armand Vauquelin and felt, for the first time in longer than she could comfortably remember, like she didn't have to do it alone. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The garden was cold and bare, and the last of the autumn light was falling at a slant across the stone wall, and somewhere inside the house Helene Vauquelin was having her afternoon tea with the woman she had taken to calling, with absolute firmness and zero irony, my girl. And outside, on the iron bench, two people who had found each other at the wrong end of something terrible were sitting in the particular quiet of people who have decided to begin.